So for a few weeks now, all the local headlines have described it as a murder-for-hire case. And in part it is. That is one very serious part of this case. Here's how prosecutors in the Eastern District of North Carolina spelled out that part of the case in just one of the criminal complaints that has been filed in association with it. They say, quote, "While living in the United States, Leonid Tafe employed a live-in housekeeper who came from Russia. The housekeeper, her husband, and their son all resided with the Tafes. At some point, the couple's employment ended and they moved out of the Tafe residence. Likewise, their son left as well. However, in February of 2018, Leonid Tafe told confidential human source number 1 that Tafe believed his wife had been involved in a romantic relationship with the housekeeper's son. Tafe wanted additional proof of the cheating. Tafe first told the confidential human source that he wanted to pay someone to get the housekeeper's son talking, then overdose him on drugs. Quote, at another point, Tafe told the confidential human source that he wanted the housekeeper's son to be kidnapped, taken into the woods, forced to admit to having sex with Tafe's wife, forced to admit that on video, and then he should be killed. Tafe told confidential human source number 1 that he had hired a private investigator to help obtain information regarding the whereabouts of the housekeeper's son. Ultimately, that private investigator would himself later be arrested and charged with multiple felonies in conjunction with this case. But the purported hitman that this guy allegedly hired, apparently to kill the housekeeper's son, that hitman ended up being a bad choice for that particular job because the alleged hitman is also described in court documents around this case as a confidential source who was working with the FBI. According to prosecutors, this past summer, this guy, Leonid Tafe, arranged for this would-be hitman, a confidential source for the FBI, arranged for him to pick up a .40 caliber pistol wrapped in plastic tape under a bush next to the Auto Wash Express car wash on Six Forks Road in Raleigh, North Carolina. The gun was left there for the would-be hitman to pick it up. And that gun that was left there under that bush at the car wash, it also, according to prosecutors, had its serial number filed off, presumably to make it more difficult to trace that gun after it had been used to kill the housekeeper's son, who this guy thought was stopping his wife. Prosecutors say in addition to providing the would-be hitman with the gun with the obliterated serial number, he also allegedly paid the would-be hitman $25,000 to carry out the murder. Now, paying the hitman $25,000 to kill the guy using the illegal gun, that was apparently only one of the alleged criminal schemes this guy pursued. Prosecutors say he also paid a $10,000 bribe to someone who worked at the Department of Homeland Security because he believed that $10,000 bribe could get this kid deported back to Russia. Quote, Tafe explained to confidential human source 1 that if the housekeeper's son was back in Russia, he would be, quote, buried already. So it's actually really 2 different murder-for-hire plots, right? He apparently thought that bribing someone from the Homeland Security Department to get the kid deported to Russia would be as good as murdering him because the kid would be killed once he had landed in Russia. According to prosecutors, it was only when that plot was taking too long that the guy decided he would go the more direct route and just pay a hitman to shoot the kid. The housekeeper's son, though, survived. Turns out both the hitman and the bribed Homeland Security employee were working for the FBI. And Leonid Tafe, the defendant in this case, has been arrested and denied bond. He's being held in custody in North Carolina. But what makes this a story of national interest now, and not just a particularly lurid crime saga from the Carolinas, is that apparently the FBI and federal prosecutors only stumbled upon this murder-for-hire, murder by deportation bribery case. They only stumbled upon this by accident because what they were looking at this Leonid Tafe guy for in the first place was a gigantic money laundering and theft case. and I mean gigantic. This looks like a government building. This looks like maybe a parliament building. This is his house. This is the house in Raleigh, North Carolina that belongs to Leonid Taif. It was raided by the FBI in the first week of December. It is a 17,000 square foot house. It's along a golf course. It's behind these big walls and gates. After the FBI raided that huge mansion and the first indictments were filed in this case, we learned that prosecutors said they intended to seek forfeiture of that huge 17,000 square foot mansion, plus another condominium owned by Taif in downtown Raleigh, North Carolina. That condo, when they raided that one, turned out to be sort of a safe house where this guy was apparently storing ammunition and cash and large numbers of guns. Prosecutors are also seeking the forfeiture of $400,000 worth of Mercedes-Benz vehicles that belong to Taif. They're also seeking the forfeiture of more than $39 million stashed in dozens of bank accounts, all accounts associated with Leonid Taif and his family. So where did this guy, Leonid Taif, get the 17,000 square foot mansion and the hundreds of thousands of dollars worth and the spare real estate? Like, it seems like he had a condo just for his guns and his cash, plus, $40 million in cash sitting around in a gazillion bank accounts. Where'd he get all that? According to the federal indictment against him, Leonid Taif accumulated all of that through an epic money laundering and theft operation. And the alleged victim of this alleged theft was the government of Russia. This is from the Justice Department press release announcing this indictment. Quote, the indictment alleges that between 2010 and 2012, Leonid Taif was the deputy director of, I'm going to say this wrong, I'm going to say Ventorg. It's V-O-E-N-T-O-R-G. I don't speak Russian. I don't know how to pronounce it. He was the deputy director of Ventorg, a company which contracted with Russia's Ministry of Defense to provide the Russian military with goods and services. Taif arranged for subcontractors in Russia to fill the various services required by Ventorg's contract. Taif and others devised a scheme requiring subcontractors to agree that a certain percentage of the government funds they would receive for completion of the work would be paid back to Leonid Taif and others involved in the scheme. These kickbacks of government funds were paid in cash and amounted to more than $150 million over an approximate 2-year span. $150 million over 2 years. That's a lot of cash. That's a lot of kickbacks. I mean, if that's the kickback amount, that's a lot of contracts for which this guy was getting these kickbacks, right? I mean, $150 million has to be a portion of the overall contracts that he's given out, if that's his cut. It's interesting, though. This is a U.S. criminal case. All of that money was allegedly stolen from Russian defense contracts. But the government in Russia apparently does not much seem to mind. They have not been pursuing this guy for this. It's U.S. prosecutors who are pursuing him. And it's U.S. prosecutors who are saying he did it. And that may be an important clue as to what's really going on here and the overall importance of this case. I mean, on its face, this is just a riveting, lurid crime story, which has been a real focus for local news in North Carolina for weeks now, for all sorts of obvious reasons. I mean, the condo with no furniture in it, stashed full of guns and ammo and money, and the hitman, and the bribe for the deportation, and the hiding the gun with the obliterated serial number under the bush at the car wash, and the gigantic mansion, and all the expensive car. I mean, you can imagine, like, LL Cool J and Chris O'Donnell solving this one on NCIS, right? I mean, this is really over the top. But now, here's the big twist that makes this not just a crime story, not just a North Carolina story. In Russia, independent media, of course, has been ruthlessly targeted and shut down and basically criminalized under the Putin government. But independent media in Russia is not gone altogether. And one of the absolutely fearless independent Russian news outlets that remains in the Putin era is called Novaya Gazeta. Novaya Gazeta's journalists are regularly threatened and not infrequently murdered in Vladimir Putin's Russia. But they still exist, they still persist, and they still report out uncomfortable news stories that the Russian government doesn't really want anybody reading about. And Novaya Gazeta has just reported something new about this lurid murder-for-hire crime case in Raleigh, North Carolina. What they're now reporting is a sort of crucial alleged detail about how this guy, Leonid Taif, got so lucky as to happen upon an insanely lucrative cash kickback scheme in Russia, where he was able to siphon out $150 million from Russian defense contracts. $50 million in 2 years without anybody in the Russian government batting an eye and with nobody coming after him. According to Novaya Gazeta, this guy Taif, who is now sitting in jail in North Carolina while prosecutors make plans to seize his mansions and his cars and his guns and tens of millions of dollars that he stashed in dozens of North Carolina banks. According to Novaya Gazeta, the way he got that money in the first place was, yes, through this kickback scheme in which he was able to pocket tons of money himself for doling out contracts for the Russian military. But specifically, what they're reporting now is that the contracts he was doling out, the person he was steering billions of rubles worth of business to in this scheme was this guy. His name is Yevgeny Prigozhin. And the reason he looks oddly familiar to you is because Yevgeny Prigozhin is becoming famous in the United States in his own right. He's the guy they call Putin's chef. He is the billionaire oligarch close to Vladimir Putin, who became a billionaire oligarch in large part because of these hugely remunerative contracts he was given from the Russian Defense Ministry, reportedly through this guy who's now been arrested and is sitting in jail in North Carolina. Yevgeny Prigozhin is believed to operate the mercenary operation in Syria that has put Russian-paid fighters into direct battle with U.S. troops. He is also famously the guy who ran the Internet Research Agency, which resulted in him becoming a defendant in one of the major indictments brought by Special Counsel Robert Mueller last year. Yevgeny Prigozhin was charged personally, along with his companies, and along with a whole bunch of Russian military intelligence officials. Together, they were all charged last year with running the online social media operation of the Russian government's campaign to disrupt our last presidential election and throw it to Donald Trump. Now, when Mueller and his prosecutors brought that case against all those Russians, Prigozhin, the oligarch, and his companies, and all those Russian military intelligence officers, nobody thought that any of those Russian defendants would ever see the inside of a U.S. courtroom, let alone a U.S. jail. Everybody thought this was essentially a speaking indictment to let the American public know what Mueller had found out about the behavior of these Russians. Nobody ever thought any of those defendants would ever even bother to, enter a plea in conjunction with this case or otherwise engage with this case or the U.S. courts in any way. It thus came as something of a surprise when, in fact, Prigozhin's companies hired U.S. lawyers and engaged on this case. They entered a not guilty plea in that criminal case. It seemed like a sort of legal oddity at first. But it soon became clear that the point of Prigozhin hiring American lawyers and contesting this case in court was to try to use the case and use those lawyers to challenge Robert Mueller, to challenge the special counsel's investigation, to try to maybe even mess up Mueller's inquiry. You've probably seen coverage over the last few weeks about some of their tactics because they're designed to get headlines. Their tactics include a whole bunch of increasingly snarky and even profane court filings produced by Prigozhin's lawyers in this case. They have quoted the movie Animal House. They have quoted cartoon characters. They have used curse words. They have made increasingly florid allegations about the special counsel's investigation more broadly and about Robert Mueller personally. You might have seen reference in the last week or so to a sort of joking reference in a court filing to a nude selfie that may exist in the Mueller case. That came from one of these super snide, deliberately provocative filings from Prigozhin's lawyers. But all the attitude from Prigozhin's lawyers and the, I think, admittedly deliberately provocative nature of the way they have argued this case for their Russian clients, they aren't doing something serious here. They have attempted to mount a serious challenge to Mueller's authority as the special counsel. They're basically trying to get the special counsel's investigation shut down. Specifically, they have structured their defense strategy in this case to try to get something the Russian government might want out of the special counsel's investigation. They have structured their defense strategy in this case to try to obtain massive amounts of information about the operations of the U.S. government, and specifically, the operations of the special counsel's office. They have tried to use their role as a defendant in this case to get information about what the special counsel's office has turned up while it's been looking into Russian interference in our election. And of course, the Russian government would love to get their hands on all that information, right? So there has been this fairly serious litigation battle going on related to this case, where Prigozhin's lawyers have been arguing in federal court in Washington that they want to use the discovery process in this case to obtain tons of information, like decades worth of information about the operations of the U.S. government. They want to obtain decades worth of information about the operations of U.S. foreign policy, U.S. military policy, U.S. intelligence agencies, U.S. operations overseas. They want to obtain as much information as they can about the U.S. government, particularly as it pertains to Russia, and about the special counsel's office and what Mueller's investigation has turned up thus far. And specifically, one of the things they have been fighting about in court is that they want to not only obtain that information as part of this court case, they want to then provide that information to Yevgeny Prigozhin, Putin's chef, right? The oligarch back home. And Prigozhin himself has no intention of coming to the United States and getting arrested and facing trial. But his lawyers are arguing that all of this information, all of this sensitive national security information, sensitive information about the investigation should be extracted from Mueller and extracted from the government and sent to Prigozhin in Russia. And that, of course, would be a serious thing, right? That would be just the same as sending all of that sensitive information directly to the Kremlin. And so that's what this litigation fight has been about. The National Security Division at the Justice Department is involved, special counsel is involved, the U.S. attorney in D.C. is involved. It's been interesting litigation. But that's what made it amazing today in federal court in D.C., when the federal judge who was presiding over this case, presiding over all this legal wrangling, basically decided to stick a pin through Prigozhin's lawyers and pull the dude's wings off. We got the transcript from today's proceeding. Quote, the judge, all right, I scheduled today's status conference for several reasons. First, I would like to set a hearing date to hear argument on Concord's motion for approval to disclose discovery. Concord is Prigozhin's company. So the defense counsel here for Prigozhin, they're representing Concord management. Second, I want to discuss the firewall counsel process to make sure that we are all on the same page. Finally, I want to discuss Concord's pending motion to compel discovery, which is now ripe. Due to the grand jury material that is the subject of this motion, I will address the merits of the motion in a sealed proceeding. But then the judge says this to Eric Dubelier, who is the lawyer for Concord Management for Prigozhin's company. The judge says this, quote, Mr. Dubelier, I will tell you now that I found your recent filings, particularly the reply brief that you filed on Friday, to be unprofessional, inappropriate, and ineffective. In a few weeks, once Concord's motion for approval to disclose sensitive discovery is ripe, I will again consider arguments that Concord previously raised about the scope of discovery that's been provided to its officers and employees. I have issued several rulings on all of Concord's pretrial motions, and I hope to discuss the timing for trial date in this case at our next court date. But Mr. Dubelier, you will prevail on your motion for release of discovery if and only if the facts and the law are on your side. Meritless personal attacks on the special counsel, his attorneys, other members of the trial team, and firewall counsel will play no role in my decision on your motion, nor will inappropriate and what you clearly believe to be clever quotes from movies, cartoons, and elsewhere. Your strategy is ineffective. It is undermining your credibility in this courthouse. I will say it plain and simple. Knock it off. Direct quote from the judge, knock it off. And at that point in the proceeding, the judge goes into a sort of lengthy-ish back and forth with the prosecutors about whether certain proceedings should happen in open court or whether they should happen with the courtroom cleared under seal. After that back and forth, she then turns back to Eric Dubelier, the lawyer for Prigozhin's company for Concord Management. She turns back to him. The judge says, quote, Mr. Dubelier, why shouldn't requests to share sensitive discovery with attorneys, paralegals, translators, and other individuals, why should that not be litigated in open court? Mr. Dubelier says, quote, Your Honor, I'm not prepared to address this or any of the other issues you've raised without consulting with my client. You've accused me of being unprofessional and inappropriate. The judge, and I think you have been. Dubelier, all right. Well, that's what you've accused me of. I need to go now and discuss that with my client and see if my client wants to continue to retain me to represent them in this matter, seeing that there appears to be some bias on the part of the court against me. The judge, there's no bias on the part of the court, Mr. Dubelier. Dubelier, well, when you personally say to someone in public that they're unprofessional and inappropriate, I take that, the judge. And what have you been personally saying about the special counsel and about the trial team in open court? Mr. Dubelier, I've been telling the truth. Every pleading I've filed before this court, I've told the truth. The judge, Mr. Dubelier, you have had many inappropriate remarks in your filings, and you know it. Dubelier, Your Honor, that's your opinion. That's your opinion. I disagree with you, but that's your opinion. You're entitled to it. What I am entitled to do is discuss that with my client before I can go any further. Judge, you are certainly entitled to discuss that with your client, but I'm going to direct you and the government to sit down and meet once you've spoken with your client, and assuming you're still representing your client, and work through some of these issues with a protective order. Mr. Dubelier, we tried to do that, Your Honor, early on, and the government's answer to everything is no. Judge, I'm directing them to sit down with you again and try to work through some of those issues pursuant to my order. Understood? Mr. Dubelier, yes, understood. So at a very basic level, the way the whole oligarch thing works under Putin is that if you're the right kind of guy, and it's always guys, there's no lady oligarchs, right? If you're the right kind of guy, Putin will let you get rich, really rich, fabulously rich. He will happily and profoundly rip off the Russian people, rip off the Russian government, rip off the assets of the Russian nation to make you personally fabulously wealthy. But then he owns you, and you serve him. You, as a fabulously wealthy person, serve the interests of Vladimir Putin and the interests of Russia and the Russian government as defined by Vladimir Putin. In the case of Yevgeny Prigozhin, a system was devised, mostly involving Russian defense contracts, that would make Yevgeny Prigozhin spectacularly wealthy, and he is. The apparent bagman who ran that operation for Prigozhin was allowed himself to skim off $150 million in cash over just 2 years. He is now sitting in a jail cell in North Carolina, where prosecutors are pursuing him not only for the lurid double murder for hire plot that he apparently carried out against the guy he thought was stooping his wife, they're also going after him for the massive theft from the Russian people and the money laundering operation that followed that allowed him to accumulate such astronomical wealth and then try to stash and spend it in the United States. The Russian government appears to be fine with that, but U.S. federal prosecutors are not. Now that they've got him, what threads does that guy's case pull, right? Prigozhin, for his part, in terms of his service to Vladimir Putin and the Russian government, he ran part of the election interference intelligence operation for the Russian government during 2016. According to Mueller's prosecutors, he ran the Internet Research Agency, all the social media stuff that targeted our election to try to swing it toward Trump. Prigozhin has since tried to turn his own indictment in that case to the advantage of the Russian government by using the U.S. court system to try to extract sensitive national security information from the government and from the investigation of the special counsel. Well, this afternoon, a U.S. federal judge, a Trump appointee, brushed that effort way back with a public dressing down and, honestly, a public humiliation of the American lawyer who was trying to carry out that effort and make a public spectacle of it at the same time. I mean, depending on what happens next here, it looks like that lawyer for Prigozhin's companies may be out. And that may indicate even weirder turns to come in this case. This is already one of the weirder storylines in the whole Russia scandal and the whole Mueller investigation. That said, new weird stuff happens all the time. I'm sure we have not hit the bottom on weird. And for what it's worth, the federal judiciary as a whole is due to run out of money in 4 days. As of the end of today, the federal government shutdown we are now enduring is the second longest one in U.S. history. If the shutdown persists through the end of this week, the U.S. federal court system has announced that the U.S. federal judiciary will be out of money and will have to start triaging its operations as of Friday this week. If the shutdown persists beyond that, if it goes on through Saturday, that will make this the longest U.S. government shutdown in American history. The consequences of this shutdown are becoming increasingly serious and expensive as we head into our third week of this. And that's not just for federal workers and their families. That's for whole swaths of the U.S. economy that basically crank down and stop working when the federal government does too. We have had government shutdowns before, but again, this is becoming one of the longest ones ever. And one of the things we are learning in this one is that it matters when there's a shutdown, whether or not the government is generally being well run or poorly run. That can make a difference as to how well the shutdown goes too. And that is why one particular White House proposal about this shutdown is putting a real shiver down people's spines for how much worse this whole thing could get, and quickly. That story's next. Stay with us.
At Safe Flight Auto Glass, we know that when you're spending time with the grandkids, every minute counts. And you don't have time for a cracked windshield. That's why at Safe Flight, we'll show you exactly when we'll be there with a replacement you can trust. Hold on, sir.
Looks great.